Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive. Today, well, games are expensive to make, right? More so than ever, and this is in large part what is causing quite a lot of tension and weirdness in parts of the industry. The idea is that games are getting more expensive to make, so either games will have to become smaller, or consumers will have to pay more, or perhaps they'll have to turn into bit-by-bit live services. But there is another angle here, one that I would say is very important and is significantly responsible for the nature of the games that you actually get. So, welcome to our investigation of what is going on here, why it's going on, and what it actually means to you. Content like this, of course, is made possible by our Patreon supporters who get the daily briefing, which is a TLDR of all the gaming news they need to know each weekday, as well as vlogs, BTS, early access to videos like our State of Activision video, which is up there right now, and of course, the big old bundle of fantasy loot this month, including the Paladin pin, and also a special bit of concept art for a project our game teams worked on. Thank you to all of the patrons for making that possible, and with that said, let's get into the video. Let's think back ages ago to the earlier days of the industry, one full of younger devs with less experience, but seemingly more creative freedom. Even what we knew as AAA felt more creative back then. Games came out constantly, some of them had a wild amount of content, and there seemed to be more innovation going on. Through the generations, though, that has seemed to slow down, especially in the AAA sector. I mean, games seem to take much longer to develop now, and they come out often feeling bare and not that innovative. I mean, if you've enjoyed single-player campaigns, you've probably noticed how they've tended to get shorter and shorter over the years. Then the large games that now do come out, well, they tend to be open worlds that are either padded full of filler content or are just massively elongated via their systems. You know, that feeling of games not having that much to them but trying to last as long as they can. I think that's a very real and often dismaying thing. So why does that happen? Well, that question, why, that is the core of today's video, and believe me, there is a massive amount to discuss. Risk. For every excellent game you remember from the past, there are many more that tried to innovate and failed. You only know about the ones that worked out because of, well, survivor bias. But as games got more and more expensive, the financial risk of making them got larger and larger, and the end result is that publishers look at the expected budget for a game and they tell developers that the game needs to sell millions or they're out on their ass. In business, that is only fair. However, these developers will then have to make safer decisions, and publishers will not greenlight anything that's not guaranteed to sell. We had Drew, the ex-BioWare writer, say rather beautifully why he left BioWare. Here's the quote: "But as we grew and became more successful, things changed. We became more corporate. We were less able to make what we loved, and the teams were pushed to create games based on market research rather than our creative instincts and passions. My dream job became just a job, and I lost the enthusiasm and excitement I once had." And unfortunately, as the business of gaming has grown larger, well, those budgets have increased, and as we've seen here, creativity doesn't really mix. So then, why are games so expensive to make? And why do publishers choose to make them so? Well, traditionally, graphics have sold. That's why 30 frames per second and a focus on graphics was opted for over 60 frames per second and, worse visuals, even though most gamers would probably prefer 60 frames per second. Graphics sell, and graphics are expensive, but they also make everything else in a game harder to do. R&D is extremely costly, and it requires some of the most expensive employees you can find. Now, those great graphics, well, they're harder to run, so actually making the game work with those better graphics, those better standards, that's going to cost more. Then the actual game content is going to be more expensive. Long gone are the days of John Romero drawing out the layout of a Doom map and being able to implement it extremely quickly using a single tile set. No, now each level has to be unique and gorgeous. It has to use extremely expensive to make assets. It's this vicious cycle. Graphics sell, so the industry focuses on them. Companies, of course, compete with each other based on those higher graphics, pushing the bar higher and higher. and then just leading to more and more money being thrown at the problem. But then, of course, that sets customer expectations, such that yes, we now need gorgeous levels and incredible graphics. That's what people expect. How can you do Mass Effect 3 facial animations in a world where gamers are now used to Naughty Dog? Simply put, content is expensive. If it doesn't seem necessary to the core experience, it's going to be left out because it costs that much. That's why content reuse through systems is so frustratingly prevalent. Loot shooters, as an example, go ham reusing story missions as repeatable content. Players want things to do, and unfortunately devs can't really afford to give it to them, so they've got to get smart. And if that all sounds bad, well, hold on, it's about to get worse, and you're going to see a side of the industry that's really not talked about that often. The scaling of costs is rather shocking. Large games need hundreds of people, and people are surprisingly expensive. First, they need to be hired, and after you get a few of those people, they're going to need a manager. They're also going to need office space, which will mean utilities and cleaning, which means even more staff. And all these people will need their wages to be paid, but once you've got so many people and so many wages, you then need finance staff to handle all of that. And then everyone needs equipment, and that means an IT department. It also means a high-end PC, specific peripherals, and terrifyingly expensive software licenses. That's not all though, as wages are heavily inflated in the industry as well, because development is often centered in massively expensive cities. Wages are inflated in dollars because of that, but employee spending power, because of the cost of things being very high in those cities, their spending power isn't actually that high. And this is not an easily solved problem because if you want talented employees, well, talent congregates in cities. Of course, that's because companies are in cities looking for the talent, and it is this vicious cycle. We are seeing some names, though, break that trend, with notable studios being set up in lesser-known cities, but the point stands, and it's a point that has literally killed studios, like Visceral, whose costs and slow progress were not financially viable, leading to their shuttering. So as you can see, the cost scaling is another massive problem, and it's one that's going to be darn hard for the industry to actually break out of. There is, however, another cost that cannot be captured in dollars. There is a huge negative to hiring so many employees on the creative side. Creativity does not scale up like production does, and things need to be set in stone if a large organization is to work effectively. Lots of different visions can result in this too many cook situation, and then a game director can only spread themselves so thin. Basically, organizational complexity hits creativity and agility the hardest. Now, if you combine that with how big budget games struggle to take risks, and yes, you have a recipe for less creation of new IP and less creativity in the big budget development that ends up driving the industry forward. We're now at a situation where basic financial viability doesn't really result in that happening. And yes, you do have these big blockbuster bets, but they're often funded by the likes of Sony, who are going to take, I would say, safe creative and technical risks, but mainly because they're trying to push their platform. And really, that's the sort of thing that you don't see the likes of, say, EA or Activision do that often. Going back to US dollars, well, making a game isn't even the most expensive part, often. Like with movies, marketing budgets can eclipse production budgets. That's even true in the past, with the original Final Fantasy VII apparently costing a huge $45 million in development. They had to pay 120 people for 2 years after all, so that makes sense. But worse yet, the marketing costs just in the USA for that game, that was apparently $100 million. Basically, marketing gets more money than games do, and that's actually because, in many cases, it is necessary. And that necessity takes us to our next point. You're probably exasperated with this. Why are we so focused on visuals? Surely we didn't need games to look great back then, so why not just make cheaper games that actually play well and focus on the story and on the content? Well, let's talk about viability in the games market, or to be a little bit more spicy, why you probably don't buy good games. This race to the top in fidelity and marketability is for a good reason. There's more entertainment being created than we can consume. Standards in the industry have risen drastically, but that has created this new axis of competition. By virtue of a few games breaking the upper limit on visuals consistently, the entire industry has to move their standards to follow suit. You see, you sort of sink or swim in the largest budget echelons of the games industry, and the most risk-averse way to actually compete there is to rely on tried and tested factors and market research. Boiled down to an average across the entire market, gamers want prettier games. That is actually what the numbers have borne out in the past. Publishers, of course, want to greenlight games that will appeal to as many people as possible, and in order to do that efficiently, they're going to borrow heavily from what works. Those games are then more likely to sell and make their money back, which reinforces that behavior. Of course, markets follow the money, and that's where the money is right now. Nothing changes until the entire market swings onto something that is new and successful and latches onto that new normal. But the thing is, the chance of your risky game being the catalyst that sparks industry-wide change, that is too low to bet on, so companies rarely do. Therefore, they fall back on the tried and the true. And that's kind of this self-reinforcing loop that we've got into with these high-budget, not very creative, and often very boring video games. There's another factor that reinforces this marketing situation, and that is consumer buying habits. You're a human being, and you buy what you want, right? But you only do that if you know about it. Discoverability is a major problem in the industry. The gaming industry is full of hidden gems for a reason. A game's quality and its success are pretty loosely correlated. It simply makes more business sense to make an expensive game if you're one of those big publishers, because every extra dollar thrown into market-friendly development is going to increase the chance of penetrating the upper echelons of the market and making your money back. In a deeply saturated AAA market, conservative spending is not really going to work out that well, or at least that is the, traditional thinking. Statistically, you are unlikely to buy a creative small game. You probably won't even know that it exists, because simply the marketing has not existed. You won't see it, and why would you even look for it when the industry is shoving these beautiful, promising games in your face at every opportunity? And while it definitely is about profiteering for AAA, that's not even the issue. It's just hard to break even. In order to guarantee that, you've got to spend more and more, and doing anything else really ends up just being too risky. Of course, that's only sustainable for so long. And before we draw this together, there is an extra thing. So recently, I was contacted by a developer who was working in a successful mobile studio. Now, he cited them earning more money than many AAA games, and having operating costs that were far lower than that of the largest companies. And he expressed sympathy to the Blizzard 800, Activision Blizzard 800, but he rightly pointed out, why would a company spend all of that money on this inefficient, expensive, and risky AAA development when a smaller team can earn far more in the mobile market? And ultimately, I think we can all understand his point there, and I think we can be pretty darn sure that big companies do as well. Just look at COD Mobile's success. Yeah, Bobby and co, they're not catching raids, they're seeking it out. And the thing is that given their literal job description as CEO, that is a totally understandable way to steer their ship. So as you've seen so far, it is all this vicious cycle, and it's one that I think isn't really that great for players. It's all just sort of emerged from, I think, fairly understandable reasons, but it's not really that great. Now, for an example, right, World of Warcraft: The Burning Crusade, that launched with 15 dungeons, and many of those dungeons looked very similar because they reused the same tile sets. So yeah, they didn't look that different, but for players, it was all content to do, bosses to kill, loot to get. And in the latest expansion, Shadowlands, well, it's launching with 8 dungeons. And sure, each one of those dungeons looks unique, it's wonderful looking, but as a player, I'd rather see the same textures, the same models a few more times, but have double the content to do. To bring it to another genre, I'd rather have Master Chief plod through a few fields or facilities that look the same if it means that I could maybe have a 10-hour campaign with more room for narrative and writing instead of a hyper-compressed 4-hour one that ultimately will be disappointing. And really, I think it's in those regards that actually gamers are losing out the most. We've increased the cost of making content in games so much, and increased the operational complexity of games that, you know what, maybe things that are just more simple, not as shiny, but, help us get more content, is actually what would best serve the desires of the people playing games. Now, some of these issues are down to the industry to fix. I think we've got to stop this visual arms race. We've got to make smarter use of assets for content. I think we've got to try to make games that rely on experience rather than purely what's objectively marketable. Funding smaller development teams and stopping this whole one game, one massive release to rule them all sort of model. Gaming is a huge industry with tons of specific markets inside it, so I think more diversified portfolios make sense. I think it's about being smart with spending, taking smaller risks for smaller rewards, but more often. And then for us customers, I think we've got to learn to divorce ourselves from marketing, right? To actually go out, to look for games that are good and buy them, to support games that are doing what we like. And if we can't find something, right, we don't know about anything, and we're looking at AAA and it's just the same usual super pretty, super expensive stuff, then I think we need to actively start trying to find new things, to stop supporting what we don't really want and start supporting what we do want. I think there's only so long we can have, infinite YouTube channels, often like this one, talking about problems in the industry. Yeah, we can do that till the cows come home, but what we should really do if we want to have a better experience as people who have gaming as their hobby is learn to seek out new good things that we like, instead of every few years coming back to Bethesda and somehow expecting things to go perfectly. So really, that's the core of the video. Changes for us as customers to make, but also changes that I dearly wish we would see happen in the higher tiers of the games industry. But there is one final point, one that really didn't fit in the rest of the video, but is extremely important, because as game tech is getting better and better because of all this big investment and funding from AAA studios, smaller studios do also benefit. Control and Hellblade are gorgeous games made on a fraction of the budget that it took some larger games. They don't look much worse than Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and they didn't cost as much as it did, which, by the way, is supposedly a huge $125 million. And I think this aspect of trickle-down technology is only going to get better in a future where we're moving towards things like, say, lighting. I mean, for all of David Cage's madness, he had a good point when he talked about lighting being important last year. Basically, we're hitting these huge diminishing returns on brute-forcing visual quality. To most people, moving from 8K or 4K to 8K is not going to be worth the performance hit. But smarter use of lighting, especially with real-time ray tracing as a feature on next-gen consoles, that will be a differentiator. It'll be more about art direction and creativity than it will be just pure asset fidelity. Even looking at Nvidia's DLSS 2.0, the Digital Foundry breakdown showed that with some tweaking, you basically won't even need to natively render at 4K to have beautiful footage. And all of these things could be really great for AA and maybe even indie developers as well. So this stuff is a benefit of all these masses of money that are being poured into the industry, but certainly when you look at Anthem, look how much that cost to make. Look how gorgeous all of those assets are. And then just look how they were basically completely in a stranglehold, and they couldn't really do anything to make a good video game. And that, I think, just is such a great example of it all going so very, very wrong. So, there you go, that is it really for this video, an exploration of why production costs in video games are going up, the scaling with staff, the marketing, the visual fidelity, and really what it's doing to our games. I think this is one of the most important issues. I think it's one that people don't really talk about that much though, but yeah, nonetheless, I think it's something we really should keep in mind. So I'd love to know, what do you think about this topic? Please do let me know in those comments. And with that, I will see you next time.